Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Regulations and methods bring preparatory theories into the conduct of war insofar as disciplined troops are inoculated with them as active principles. The whole body of instructions for formations, drill and field service are regulations and methods. In the drill, instructions the first predominate, in the field service instructions the latter. To these things the real conduct of war attaches itself. It takes them over, therefore, as given modes of proceeding, and as such they must appear in the theory of the conduct of war. But for those activities retaining freedom in the employment of these forces, there cannot be regulations, that is, definite instructions, because they would do away with freedom of action. Methods, on the other hand, as a general way of executing duties as they arise, calculated, as we have said, on an average of probability, or as a dominating influence of principles and rules carried through to application, may certainly appear in the theory of the conduct of war, provided only they are not represented as something different from what they are, not as the absolute and necessary modes of action, systems, but as the best of general forms which may be used as shorter ways in place of particular disposition for the occasion at discretion. But the frequent application of methods will be seen to be the most essential and unavoidable in the conduct of war, if we reflect how much action proceeds on mere conjecture or incomplete uncertainty, because one side is prevented from learning all the circumstances which influence the dispositions of the other, or because, even if these circumstances which influence the decisions of the one were really known, there is not, owing to their extent and the dispositions they would entail, sufficient time for the other to carry out all necessary counteracting measures, that therefore measures in war must always be calculated on a certain number of possibilities. If we reflect how numberless are the trifling things belonging to any single event, and which therefore should be taken into account along with it, and that therefore there is no other means to suppose the one counteracted by the other, and to base our arrangements only upon what is of a general nature and probable, if we reflect lastly that owing to the increasing number of officers as we descend the scale of rank, less must be left to the true discernment and ripe judgment of individuals, the lower the sphere of action, and that when we reach those ranks, where we can look for no other notions but those which the regulations of the service and experience afford, we must keep them with the methodic forms bordering on those regulations. This will serve both as a support to their judgment and a barrier against those extravagant and erroneous views which are so especially to be dreaded in a sphere where experience is so costly. So in here, von Clausewitz completes the set of notions in the doctrine, right, as a method for the theory of the art of war, talking about the regulations and methods. In the previous paragraph, we have seen the laws, the principles, and the rules, and how they're employed, how they operate, what their characteristics are. So regulations and methods are kind of the smaller elements in the set disposal of doctrine as method, and they essentially apply to certain situations which they can be kind of more mechanically employed, given the relative lack of power in certain moments to try to sort out the whole system, right? And when this is valid also for law, principle, and rule, etc. But let's say that, as we will see, we have just read, regulations and methods are the simplest form of these notions, as they can be applied in a very limited scenario of warfare, from which not much depends, right? Even at the level of the soldier. Whereas the other intuitions, let's say, are more important for the upper ranks, given, however, that basically all the army still is to deal with all of the doctrine as a method, but simply in different amount, given also the condition in which they find themselves, not just in the rank, right, but maybe the tactical, strategical situation of it. So here from and also, as we have read, von Clausewitz explains why such approach is the case, right, to be employed in these circumstances, because fundamentally there is not a great risk after all in employing them, right? The risk increases as much you rise into the general principles and you rise through the ranks and have to cope with a much more complicated set of information that objectively the lower ranks, for their own raison d'être, we can say, do not have to, right? So the things get always more complicated at the top, while when you go down to the ranks, you can essentially applicate something more mechanically, right? Always given that you need judgment, you need still an experience, you need certain moral qualities to do that, right? But this is still important, and he explains why it is the case. So von Clausewitz writes, regulations and methods bring preparatory theories into the conduct of war insofar as disciplined troops are inoculated with them as active principles. Now, this first definition is important because it makes you understand it's as if you literally vaccinated your troops. Like you teach them that here we're talking about the, all the troops, right? It's theoretically the lowest ones also, right? And specifically that there is that basic set of notions that given their rank that they have to perform, right? They have to be aware of. They have to, to still be able to applicate autonomy, because there is always an amount of autonomy, right? If anything, every time you receive an order, you're always, essentially looking at you're in charge of the situation. If anything, for yourself, that is very important. So there is always a margin of individuality in the military action, after all, right? And it's as if you had to teach these soldiers that there is a set of things that you have to do in a given situation, right? You don't have to tell them that they have to do it in every single one. But generally speaking, they have to be aware that generally, in fact, on average, that is the case, right? And it has to be something reactive, right? Even something instinctual. If you look at a certain training, even of the most basic things like shooting someone, right? The way we have overcome, for example, this human instinct of generally not wanting to kill your fellow man on the spot, but we've come away. We train troops to be mechanic about it and not to think too much, after all, because we found out that paradoxically it saves many more lives on the long run than the contrary. But at the same time, the important here is that this whole, and von Clausewitz goes on, the whole body of instructions for formations, drill and field service are regulations and methods, right? So this is literally what we're talking about: formations, drill, so maneuver, also field service, so things that do not have even necessarily to do with combat directly in itself, but that are needed to make an army work. And naturally, the army is not going to work all the time, right? And there is always an army is going to be wiped out at some point. So that thing eventually will crumble. That is a big deal, because naturally who is in charge of the whole thing must acknowledge that those are human lives. There are people that are part of a unit that at one point ceases to consistently exist. But the troops do not have largely to think about it. They just have to apply the orders, right? Obey to the orders, and knowing how to do certain things mechanically, right? Then things can go, seriously wrong, and at that point, we're not automatons, so you're gonna give up at one point under pressure. But still, this set of notions is what has made you arrive to that point intact and possibly alive, right? So the idea is also here that it's a set of notions, right? So it's not necessarily these regulations and methods are something fairly less systematic than principles or rules, right? They are literally the closest that arrives to a set of practical knowledge, just to have able to replicate once you're told how to do it. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, to these things the real conduct of war attaches itself. Because he stresses here the real conduct of war, right? It's part of how war effectively moves, for example. And it says it takes them over, therefore, as given modes of proceeding, and as such they must appear in the theory of the conduct of war, right? So, and this is really true, and it's very interesting because, as also we have seen in the third chapter, especially at the beginning, when von Clausewitz describes how the theory of the art of war evolved historically speaking, well, the base was starting exactly from this stuff, right? For how soldiers had to, even at the maniacal level, what kind of move they had to do in order to, to reload a musket, right? That's an important thing after all, because that's how soldiers effectively fight. But is it the most important thing in terms of all the things that are happening at that given moment? Of course not, and that is how eventually the theory of the art of war has evolved, saying, okay, we can't deal just with this mechanical, practical notions, because that's not how we actually wage war already, because war, is being waged always is in the same way. It's still the theory that had lagged behind, right? And naturally, the theory also of the art of war backed, the effectiveness of how to perform certain, how to wage war on a certain scale, with a certain degree of complexity, but that's a path that, politics and society have historically undergone, because a society produces the intellectual resources to to study these things and to describe them effectively. But war, this is important, also has always worked by itself. You can't perfection it though, and these things, as simple as they seem, however, are very important, because even from the disorder, the systemic disorder can emerge from not having such regulations and drill and other service fields. But lots of things can go wrong, and von Clausewitz is a great fan of this, because he will see it better with the concept of friction, that pretty messed up things can begin starting exactly with this, from the smallest of things that are taking place in the arm. So, and then von Clausewitz goes on and says, but for those activities retaining freedom in the employment of these forces, there cannot be regulations. That is, definite instructions, because they would do away with freedom of action. And that's what we began to talk about before. That is the realization that indeed these are just a set of notions, right? And of regulations, of methods that soldiers must know how to, to perform, right? But still, there is a dimension that requires the discretion of the individual, right? And you can arrive to discipline basically everything on this base, ideally, but that wouldn't quite work. Like, even if we manage to, this is the paradox. Von Clausewitz reasons in very scientific terms. Even if you were to basically describe the entire, system functionment of a soldier from the moment he wakes up and so the moment he goes to sleep, you basically dictate him every single move, every single step he has to do, still that soldier wouldn't even have the time to, to learn that. It's much simpler to make him do it. There is that scene from A Few Good Men, with Tom Cruise, where at the trial, the protagonist asks this, I don't remember, it was a surgeon or no, I don't remember actually. It says, how do you follow the regulations? Those regulations do not exist, right? Because they had these military men had said everything is basically regulated, and the lawyer asks, can you find this in the military manual, the indication of where to go to eat? And the soldier says, but I can't find it in manual. And Tom Cruise asks, and then how did you know? Well, the soldier answered, "Well, I think I just followed the others to the mess hall, right?" That's just the movie is fine. It's great acting. Maybe it's not extremely realistic in certain things, but that line was actually pretty good because it was highlighting exactly this side for other reasons. Any movie, if you know it, of course, is pretty famous, but this is exactly the point von Clausewitz is making, right? There is a set of notions that beyond actually this rule are performed, especially in those moments in which really nobody actually told you what you have to do in the first place, right? You can train as much as you want at a shooting range, but when you're in front of the enemy, you're under fire. Do you have an instructor always behind you? You're gonna take action. Where you have to stand, from which place you have to respond to fire, how you have to take it. I mean, it's all things that you decide on factors that cannot be taught to you, until you are in them. And this is not valid just from an abstract point of view, in the sense that, of course, every battlefield is different, every tactical situation is different. I mean, every enemy is different, right? But also on the fact that there are objectively that objectively in these regulations and methods, there is not such a thick net of dispositions for which you're told whatever is going to happen. Even in the logical links that are naturally theoretical, so they don't even have the presumption of telling you what you will have to face in every situation. So von Clausewitz here is pointing out that as much as we have seen for the higher principles, like fact principles, rules, etc., this set of notions is given as a tool for the army to work mechanically, but at the same time this mechanics is subjected to many other factors that you can't quite describe even in themselves, that do not need to be described in the first place. Everything has to be fairly simple, right? And the ability in that regard in drawing a theory of the art of war stands in your synthesis capabilities, in the effectiveness of your thinking, in its rationality, but also this inherent economical struggle between what is needed to be known and what that takes away by itself resources, right? It takes away more time in the training, actually even material resources in this regard, and therefore must be aimed chiefly at a practical use. And this is very important because if you followed the series, you know that von Clausewitz has criticized the abstraction of the uselessness, right, of abstractions when you're thinking about what you have to do practically in war, right? What you have to do practically in war is not trying to fall in the delusion of describing literally everything that can happen to you, but just finding what effectively can work as an amount of notions that can help you in a certain situation that you must cope with with time and other resources that are brutally limited, right? This, as we've seen also in the previous videos, has a lot of implications also for for what concerns the actual understanding of war from the side of the military, right? There is just a tiny part of the military that understands war. Now we are grown with this kind of emotionalistic / poetic ideal that you don't know what war is until you're there, but this is not actually the point. I mean, you don't know what sufferings can be until you're not in war. On that I agree, but that going to war or living into a historical period, or because you can find many parallelism in this case, and understanding it is actually two very different things. But I mean, two very different things, and that's why we study strategic culture and military history, and because there is no other way, effective, not even for the military, through military experience only, to come to the to the denucleation of these of this theory without a reflection that goes beyond not what happens on the field, but that that goes beyond whether you are there or not, in the sense that, of course, the military experience is the single most important element that funds the theory of the art of war. Military history is less important, but it's still there and is complementary to it. It can perfection to it. But von Clausewitz here is simply saying that if you are a private, you don't necessarily understand why you're being sent there, why this whole thing is happening in the first place, and generally speaking, if you don't have an additional understanding of reality there, you can see atrocious violence, sufferings. You can understand very deep aspects of war that nobody, fortunately for those people, can arrive to understand through that hell, right? But at the same time, that is not sufficient. That is not what war is all about, right? War cannot be understood without a deep realization of what politics or society is in the first place. And it takes a lot to understand it, as much as it takes a lot to be there, right, in the first place. And I don't want to sound anti-military here. This is a point I make often to make you understand essentially the difference that in the intellectual commitment that is required in war between voice at the top and voice at the bottom. And the reason is that without that intellectual commitment, voice at the top couldn't handle the thing, right? It's not just about intellectual commitment. It takes a lot of moral resources, right? You can't do it if you're a weak person, right? Most of us cannot do that, but still that extra knowledge is required. And this has a lot of implications, because we live in societies that make war, right? We live in societies where we discuss what war is, how the military instruments should be employed. We come from, if you want, even a recent past in which most of us participated to military affairs. You think about mandatory levy, or even look at our grandfathers' generation during the war. I mean, the relation between politics and violence is something we are basically all aware of in a way or another. But understanding it deeply doesn't happen necessarily through simply having been there. This is particular. That can have, no doubt, massive impact on your lifestyle, on your political beliefs, on whatever. But it's not necessarily understanding it at one point. There are still deep misunderstandings at a popular level of a lot of wars that have been fought recently, at the point that people, and this is really the point, and that's why I stress it so much, deny historical reality because of their emotional response to war. Right, and this is a very serious issue, because if you misunderstand what that war has been, even if you have been personally deeply hurt from it, you're not going to render a good service to your community. And this is a topic nobody discusses, because we have a somewhat detached, generally speaking, a detached relation with military historical studies, and war in general from an ideological point of view, at least for most people. But I must say that ideologism towards war sometimes is, is as much from one side and the one from another. Like, there are a lot of militarists as much as pacifists, for what I'm concerned, and I can see. That is an issue. That is a problem, right? Because they're basically the double face of same metal, that is the one of ignorance towards war in the first place. But this is a digression that maybe we can skip now. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, methods, on the other hand, as a general way of executing duties as they arise, calculated, as we have said, on an average of probability, or as a dominating influence of principles and rules carried through application, may certainly appear in the theory of the conduct of war, provided only they are not represented as something different from what they are, not as the absolute and necessary modes of action. so systems, but as the best of general forms which may be used as shorter ways in place of a particular disposition for the occasion at discretion, right? This is very important, right? So you can have the set of regulations and methods, right? And this is extendable in part to the same rules and principles we've seen in the previous video, right? That there is a set of knowledge that has a different function on the, especially at a level, of organic, right? Everyone has to do something that has to do how to work, make the army work, right? And it's a system, it's an organism. It works all together. But at the same time, you can have a set of notions that effectively is doctrine as a method, right? That exists because we arrived at a certain level of awareness about how, in the military at least, on how in fact the military instruments should work proper, right? Not necessarily how it has to be employed, because that is political, that is what politics has to deal with, but how it effectively, those armed forces are employed instrumentally, right? But this is just, once again, an approximate set of notions that require, at every given moment, capacity, a discretion that will always make them work essentially in a different way. So the doctrine helps. The doctrine is the backbone of a lot of, of what concerns, military education. But doctrine can also be wrong. In the last video we made the example of World War I, right, where you see that actually doctrine was updated, after 3 months at the beginning of the war. Every army basically knew how World War I had to be fought, right? So once again, I repeat it every time, but it's funny because I care about it, many people still believe otherwise. World War I was fought, in this sense, in the best possible ways, right? Trench warfare, contrarily to what is commonly believed, was an extremely sophisticated type of war. It required an enormous intelligence and commitment. It wasn't at all the blind and obtuse way of warfare we have depicted. The massive problem was what happened before, right? Mostly a political problem, right? But in that case, it's meaningful because also a doctrinal one. I mean, the military had not. There had been a few voices before the war, also in the decades before the war. Maybe sometimes we should talk about it, of isolated talents or geniuses even that had figured out how effectively World War I would have been fought since the 1880s. That they have said it quite clearly, but the main problem was political. They thought war would have been fought in a completely different way, and they were wrong. So that is a perfectly good historical example of how doctrine, albeit generally speaking, refined. I mean, doctrines have been employed most of the times effectively, successfully, but still always with a margin of repairability, let's say. But in that case, it was a big mistake. Like, it was a big misconception, misassessment, misevaluation of what would have effectively taken place. So just to say that you can't blindly adopt doctrine in war as if that's simply how we have to do. I have a manual now, I use it. No, we have studied here at the 1/3 of the Vom Kriege, demonstrating the exact opposite at every moment, that war is always changing, that its character by itself. I mean, warfare is actually always the same. It's the means in which it's fought that change depending on the situation, right? And don't think that war changes in the essentials, that von Clausewitz, is outdated because he was writing from the 1830s. This work is valid for all war, and not so surprisingly, even, the airspace or cyber warfare is showing us exactly that von Clausewitz was pretty damn right about everything he wrote, and that it fits perfectly, and we still use von Clausewitz in this regard, for this very reason. But that war is always something that plays beyond the rules. Another reason for which there is nothing like conventional warfare of symmetric warfare. If you meet anyone who uses terms like symmetric warfare, conventional warfare, and pretends them to be an actual thing and not, unfortunately, the approximation may be needed for the sake of, making someone understand certain aspects of it, just know that it's those people do not know what war is in the first place. They have never studied from Clausewitz. They have never studied military history for real, right? War is, by definition, throughout all the history of humanity, asymmetric and unconventional. There's never been a single historical moment in which a doctrine has been equal to another, tactic has been equal to another, hell, an individual has ever been equal to another, right? So war has always been and will always be unconventional and asymmetrical by definition. And war will never be and has never been symmetrical or conventional. Never, right? And the major military disasters have passed chiefly through this asinine conception there can be asymmetric warfare or conventional warfare, because the task of warfare is exactly passing by any conventionality, if it could ever exist, right? Which in the realm of physics, as we know it, cannot happen. This is a physical principle. This is not a personal opinion about warfare. There's not a single system that is equal to another in nature. Not even one. So, so here he used, it was a long phrase, and but the meaning is very simple. Okay, never take these regulations or methods as absolutes, even if these are paradoxically the ones that get closer to it, because they're simpler, right? So they get closer to a positive, application, just like, I don't know, tactics does in relation to strategy, for example, because it's simpler, right? But don't be fooled by it, because when you are out there, it will not go as you thought. Right, and war is effectively all about this, that as we've seen also in the first book, von Clausewitz explains why most of warfare actually is not about combat. Most of warfare is about the suspension of combat and doing lots of other things that have to do with the preparation for combat. In a system that is constantly degenerating from an energetic point of view, like this, once again, it's a physical problem, right? You can't presume that regulations and methods will fit in an absolute system that works always the same way. Accidents happen, right? Everything you can't contemplate happens, right? And that's why von Clausewitz stresses the importance of realizing this first of all, but also of the individuality individuality of judgment in every single moment when you applicate this stuff, so that not even for an instant you have to think the doctrine as a method is an absolute, that war is fought just in one way and you have to follow the book and then it's done. No, it doesn't happen like that. And now he gets a bit deeper into explaining why, because he says, but the frequent application of methods will be seen to be most essential and unavoidable in the conduct of war if we reflect how much action proceeds on mere conjecture or in complete uncertainty, because one side is prevented from learning all the circumstances which influence the dispositions of the other, or because, even if these circumstances which influence the decisions of the one were really known, there is not, owing to their extent and the dispositions they would entail, sufficient time for the other to carry out all necessary counteracting measures, right? That therefore measures in war must always be calculated on a certain number of possibilities. Other very long phrase, but if you have followed it, it's also here pretty simple, right? Von Clausewitz uses the preposition ex absurdum now and says, just imagine. First of all, he says you have to take in consideration always that war is a duel. You're fighting against a living and reacting object. or subject if you prefer. So that, first of all, you're not in the enemy's mind. So the enemy's mind is always unknown to you, right? And even if you knew, right, and with a certain level, and we don't know why, because if you don't have telepathic powers, it's a bit difficult, and there is no scientific evidence whatsoever to pretend that thing is true. You still maybe have that knowledge, but you still live in a world of physics, and you can't counteract against the enemy immediately. You have to make an effort in which things happen in the meanwhile before you can take action. And this thing, incidentally, however, updates constantly, right? So that the enemy, here it's an absurd situation, as you understand, but if you were thinking the enemy may change thought, and you may have to work according to that. But von Clausewitz makes it clear and obvious, right? We don't even know what's in the enemy's mind, but most of the times we don't even know anything about even our full forces, right? That is quite important as well. Always remember, this thing that I must confess has always impressed me. This fact that von Clausewitz estimates at 25% the amount of knowledge that we usually get, right, or we can get, because that I think is a maximum, in order to take action in war. In fact, considering what we should know fully, right, which means that of all the things that we should know in order to applicate ourselves eventually to behave accordingly, to take a military action, is the 25%, right? That is, I don't know, think about driving a car, knowing the 25% of what it needs to be done to drive one. That's a kind of weird comparison, but that is also pretty meaningful. The interesting thing is that the enemy doesn't know either. So there is all a realm of of speculation. Here, if you think von Clausewitz has written decisions. No, he said, however, there is always, and this is very important too, and we have encountered it before, that there is always, when you're in war, you have always to reason in terms of possibilities, right? There's never there's never certainty as such. You have to reason in terms, there is a certain amount of possibility for this to go completely differently also sometimes. And this actually can happen in many other contexts, telling the truth, right? It can happen, how you foresee to write a thesis, for example. How do you know how it's going to be like in the end, right? This is real life, and von Clausewitz simply makes a case that, in war it's much worse than the usual, because in war, you know that you're much more pressured than average, so you must act much faster. You can gather information compared to other human activities, so it gets even more complicated. So once again, even if you knew what the enemy was up to, you still have to deal with the application of these regulations and methods that are not necessarily applicable in the same way you expected them to be, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, if we reflect how numberless are the trifling things belonging to any single event, and which therefore should be taken into account along with it, and that therefore there is no other means to suppose the one counteracted by the other, and to base our arrangements only upon what is of general nature and probable. So this is a bit the same thing. Consider that we, there can be, here there is a bit of wisdom, because it has that even if we don't know everything, and that's something which explains also the positivity of war, still, however, in an unpredictable way, still there are certain factors that do counteract each other, right? There are certain forces that maybe can even neutralize each other, that after all, yes, we live in a dreadfully complicated system, but there is also a hierarchy of these actions, right? So that we can't, it's as if it was just a great fluid, and we couldn't distinguish exactly where something begins and something ends, right? But we can, spot certain currents and follow them, right? This is a good metaphor if you want. Still, however, we have no mean, in fact, to make it a science, to determine whether, this is going to always happen in that way, but especially at the given moment, when action is taking place, we have no idea of how this can be fixed in a system. We can't photograph that and have the means of, carving out of it all what we need, but not even the major part of it, right? So and Von Kriege says, if we reflect lastly that owing to the increasing number of officers as we descend the scale of rank, less must be left to the true discernment and ripe judgment of individuals, the lower the sphere of action, and that when we reach those ranks where we can look for no other notions but those which the regulations of the service and experience afford, we must help them with the methodic forms bordering on those regulations, right? So here it's the idea, you are aware that everybody has to, first of all, you have to rely on someone else, which is also a very important thing in war. We haven't maybe stressed it a long time, but that's what the hierarchy, the ranks practically are. And therefore we are all depending on one another. But we also have to give people a training and education in this regard. And it arrives a point where we can essentially make troops working in a more mechanical way, telling them to do things that, hold as much as you can given what you have learned, right? And not requiring much more, because after all, as we were saying before, even resources for training an army are somewhat limited, and yet this is not even a matter of, an army would be better if, through even common soldiers were taught in strategical affairs. Well, really not, right? It could be better, it may be, I don't know, in fact at the decisional level, if we're talking about NCOs or other officers, but, or officers, excuse me, but the way the army is shaped in this regard, and the way doctrine is being structured historically, shows us that after all, you can maybe even hyper train and educate, but at the end of the day, what you need is a hierarchy that at the top takes the right actions, and then things can go so wildly differently from what you expected that it's not having trained a soldier more or better that's going to make the difference. On the contrary, could even be a problem. You can't train a soldier forever. After a while, humans break down psychologically. They're not good for use anymore. You also need more resources to do that. Not necessarily you can afford them. Instead of having more people sent to war, for example. This naturally depends. It depends on the doctrine that is shaped on the base of, the political and social dimension from which that army is drawn. But it's not exactly what it's gonna, you must, even in there, a doctrine is not what makes the war won, necessarily speaking. Take World War II. The Nazis had objectively the best doctrine out there. Did they win? No. Why? Well, because, and those are the questions that make you realize that, and that was based on largely also a matter of knowledge. As von Clausewitz doesn't. It's not that von Clausewitz predicts these things. He describes them, how they are in war, effectively. The Nazis didn't know what the hell there was from the other side. They had miscalculated big number, tens of numbers of the quantity of Soviet divisions. There was a major miscalculation I still think that, hell, I would like to discuss so much these things one day in some video, but um, things could go otherwise as well. But at the same time, largely that was a miscalculation, a gross miscalculation, and whatever's could have gone. Still, this proves the fact that von Clausewitz is saying pretty sensible things. Now, so where were we? Owing to increasing officer, okay, so yeah. And lastly, he says, this will serve both as a support to their judgment and a barrier against those extravagant and erroneous views, which are so especially to be dreaded in a sphere where experience is so costly. Now, here von Clausewitz stresses the real problem behind this. That is, are there alternatives to this system? Like, we'll see it better next video, which he says, what can we do with this information, right? Is it doctrine as a method the best option? Well, yes, it is, right? And the reason is that this is economically the best option, right? Not that we're calculating, merely, how much is convenient to us in relation to our resources. No, in relative terms, this is about the set of theoretical notions that help to maximize results independently from the amount of resource that you have at your disposal. Doctrines do vary. Yes, they do vary, as we said before, also on the basis of these resources, but their essence, the way they're composed, right, the same validity of them, of their existence, is what matters in this context, right? So you can't, once again, pretend to win a war knowing everything you can know, right, in theory, because, or ideally, let's say better, because you will not be able to. You should expand knowledge, of course, in every given military action, but you already know that it's not going to be nearly enough to solve the problem. So what is important at some point is to make the system strive to adapt it, to make it evolve, right, to make it transform, to the various needs of warfare, because doctrines change historically, because reality changes. And that's the real problem, right? These are not sets of notions that you write at the beginning just looking at the sky and wondering how war is. This thing is built massively on military experience, which by a certain degree is, the history is assimilable even in the military experience, in the sense that still someone who was there, was evaluating it from a military perspective, had to exist, right? And this should be a lesson for whoever pretends to study strategy, starting from fields that do not give you, in fact, a strategical culture. Strategical culture is acquired only in two ways: direct military experience, military history, right? The military has kind of both. There are good military men who are also military historians in this regard, and theoretically have a better understanding of what this thing is. It's not always true, right? As we were saying in the beginning, also, well, this eludes even this concept, but, there are lots of people who sell because they, they've been to war, so they must tell you what, all this thing about literature, about the importance of leadership, right? All this stuff that, if you read it, it seems to be written by, 12 years old. I mean, let's be honest about this obsession for the right set of rules or principles, right? That, go back to von Clausewitz. Why do you have to waste so many, pages and poor trees that get chopped down just to write this stuff? It can be, I'm sure it can write a military account. That's way more interesting, right? And reflect and criticize on it. But don't pretend to come up with something new as if war had changed in the essentials. Let's all go back to von Clausewitz. It's much easier for everybody. Right? The truth, in fact, as we were saying at the beginning, nobody has a solid strategical education. on average. There is a stressed nobody because it's as if, and I'm saying I have it, for example, I like to see myself on the path towards it, right? In this regard, there's many other things, like never fully convinced about the rightness of what I do, but I do it well, right? But at least, realize that these topics are not detached from reality, right? It really makes a difference for you to know these things or not knowing them. And I know it requires time, it requires a lot of commitment and resources, and most people don't have it, hence explained why we don't have this consciousness, as we don't have a consciousness about a lot of other things, about science, about other even social aspects of the world we live in. But we should make an effort to try to understand, right? This would fluidify so many problems, it would deliver us from so many obstacles and intellectual impediments. They're always there, right? I'm trying, to think beyond what Schwerpunkt can be, because I'm making this. Schwerpunkt is mostly about history, and I want it to be about history, but it can't be just a storytelling channel. It must be a channel that's started, even in its historical side, to make people reflect. This is not a race. I didn't come here to be in competition with other people and who has the best opinion, who's best informed, most accurate. I come here with the information I have, that I have explored for years, and I think I have carved something important from, right? And this is not this is all about von Clausewitz. The Vom Kriege can do this for you. Study the Vom Kriege. Don't listen. Even if you have the option, don't listen to me. Study the Vom Kriege, right? Study it, not read it, because I can grant you that if you read the Von Clausewitz once or twice or thrice, you will not understand. You must spend a lot of time on it. You have to study effectively. You have to weight everything he says, because otherwise you don't get it, right? You can get an impression and a good perspective on it, but it's still different from studying it, right? But just know that when you'll do it, you'll be a different person for the better. I can assure you. It works, right? It works, and it can help a lot of people with serious problems. It can help us with politics when our governments fail. It can help us with, in fact, with these decisions that revolve also, but also the approach that we have towards war. I think that's a very important step to better our political education. But also, it makes you realize what are the limits of mankind. And after all, it shows it in a way that is enlightening about instead what we can do. And we get surprised at that point of how much we can do that we didn't think it was possible. Military history helps you in this regard more than many other disciplines, and it must be studied, it must be learned. We can't live in 2020 without military education, strategical education in this proportion. Right? It's inconceivable for the level of complexity of our societies to live without knowing the thinking of von Clausewitz, and we will pay for this. I can assure you. We're already paying. We've always been paying for it, but it will get worse, right? Because we will get out of control of a lot of aspects that today we give for granted, but they're already, fading quite quickly, right? Anyhow, well, I didn't want to sink your morale more than what the current situation does. But for now, stop it here. I think next time we will maybe end. Yes, I think we can end the 4th chapter. And for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.